I'm blind, but I just saw something in the darkness. I fully lost my sight 20 years ago, so imagine my initial euphoria after 2 decades of living in a blackened world, upon seeing something on last night's walk home. Though this may beg a belief, I hope I never see anything again. My guide dog, Ted, took the lead to suggest we should continue walking home, but I was transfixed by a red pinprick in the distance. Now, without offering too graphic a description of my childhood injury, my eyes are non-existent. This isn't a case of partial blindness. I don't see lights, shadows, or shapes. I have spent 20 years in absolute darkness, without hope of ever seeing anything again. And yet, inexplicably, a red shape loomed on the horizon. Excited and shocked in equal measure, I diverted from my daily path and headed towards the first thing I had seen since the age of 10. Ted whined grumpily, confused by our sudden detour, but he begrudgingly led me along winding streets, far from the ceaseless chatter and loud vehicles of the city. It took about 15 minutes of walking into the depths of what I assume must have been a sleepy neighbourhood, for the red speck on the horizon to grow into a distinguishable shape. It was a house. A red-bricked new build sitting in the midst of the endlessly black void that had been my entire world for so many years. And after another 15 minutes of walking along seemingly endless roads, we were finally standing before the mysterious building. Ted growled, and I felt the lead move in the opposite direction as he tried to guide us back the way we came. "I can see it, boy," I whispered tearfully. "Tell me you see it too. I'm not crazy, am I?" Ted started barking and yanking more assertively on the lead, but I gripped tightly and pulled him towards the house, before stumbling painfully into something metallic. I fumbled with my free hand, fairly certain that I'd found the house's front gate. Contending with a distressed and noisy dog at my side, I eventually found and lifted the latch, shoving the gate open. The house was entirely unremarkable in and of itself. I'd expected a glitzy, futuristic building, given it had been so long since I'd seen the world, but it looked no different from every other British home I remembered from my childhood. Red bricks, brown roof tiles, and white framed windows. The number 11 was plastered in gold on a black, featureless front door. Ted must have planted his paws firmly on the ground, because I had to practically drag him along the path leading up to the front door. "I know you're scared. I don't understand it either, Ted," I said. "But I might never see anything ever again. I have to know what's happening. I have to find out how and why I can see this place. Please just let me see whether anyone answers. I promise we'll go home afterwards." Trembling, with a feeling that had morphed from excitement into sheer anxiety, I weakly knocked on the black front door before me. A wave of pins and needles passed through my hand as I realised something. The door was real. I felt it. I'd convinced myself that the house must be a figment of my imagination, but there was no denying that my knuckles had rapped against the familiar feel of a softwood surface. My heart pounded erratically as the reality of my situation dawned on me. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. I was standing before something I could see. I looked around to find that the rest of my world remained a dark and empty chasm. I couldn't even see Ted at my feet, though I could certainly hear his agitated sounds. So why could I see the house? And then there was a sudden sharp noise. Metal barreling rapidly against wood. It had to be the door lock. "Hello?" I called it. "I was wondering whether I might be able to speak to the owner of the house." Footsteps pattered softly away, I think. And usually I'd be able to hear a pin drop in another room. In the absence of sight, many blind people will tell you that their other senses become heightened. And yet, it was as if the sudden introduction of colour and shapes to my world had lessened my usually sharp hearing. But there was much more to this unexplained event than that. Sight? What sight? I don't have eyes, I thought to myself. "Hello?" I called again. "Please, I just want to talk." A door opened. It sounded like a side door leading out onto the walkway. I know it was foolish, but you don't know how it feels to spend years in darkness and finally be offered a glimmer of light. I couldn't resist, though Ted did. Stumbling across the front lawn, tripping over a bramble-ridden bush, I made my way around to the side of the property. Sure enough, an open side door blew lazily in the early evening breeze. Ted's barks were growing hoarse, and he had instead resorted to a fearful whimper. I'm not sure why I wasn't afraid at that moment, but I would be. As I stepped through the doorway, I entered a glistening kitchen. White, pristine, sterile. "Hello?" I called for a third time. "I really need to talk to you. Do you know what's happening to me? What is this place?" Through the open kitchen doorway, the main lobby was illuminated by an overhead light. Ted stood invisibly beside me, but I could see every part of the house itself, every furnishing and light fixture, and that included the reflection in the tall mirror hanging in the entryway. The artificial light cast onto the glass pane was part of the house, after all. And so, for the first time in 20 years, I saw myself and the uncertain little golden retriever beside me. The last time I'd seen my face I was a child, but before me stood a bearded man with a weary face and 2 glass eyes. I couldn't quite make the connection that I was looking at myself. Stroking my beard thoughtfully, I took slow strides towards the mirror. How could it be that a man with no eyes was able to see himself, to see anything? The terror started to work its way into my brain. Gone was the sheer joy I'd felt upon seeing things again. The impossibility of my situation was ringing alarm bells, as it already had for Ted. As overjoyed as I felt to see anything other than constant darkness, I was acutely aware of the fact that everything about that house was terribly wrong. And then I caught the reflection of a small shape flitting behind me. It had the appearance of a young boy, but I didn't need to get a proper look to know that there was something distinctly unnatural about him. I screamed, spinning around. The floorboards creaked beneath the weight of something slipping up the stairs, giggling as it went. An invisible thing. I'd only been able to see it in the mirror. It isn't part of the house, I realised. Ted started barking, pulling on his lead to chase whatever had disappeared up the stairs. "Who's there?" I croaked frightfully. No response, other than fading giggles and footsteps across the upstairs landing. But I finally accepted that there were no answers to be found in that place. None that would make any sense anyway. And so I turned to face the kitchen again, pulling Ted's lead. "Come on," I gulped. "You've got your wish, boy. Let's get out of here." As I started to walk towards the open side door in the kitchen, strangely relieved to see the black outer world that awaited me, I was baffled to find that Ted was standing still, and he wouldn't budge. I turned to look at the mirror in the lobby, and I could see the reflection of my dog standing in a frozen position before the stairs. "Are you kidding me?" I cried. "You were right, Ted. This place is wrong. Let's go." reaching from somewhere beyond the reflection of the mirror. 2 hands, withered but clearly those of a child, swiftly swooped towards my dog, and by the time I'd blinked, Ted had been unclipped from his lead. He vanished up the stairs with a loud whimper. "Ted!" I screeched, running back into the lobby. I hauled my body up the stairs 2 at a time, forgetting something crucial. I could see the house, but I could not see its inhabitant. And when I reached the upstairs landing, I found myself plummeting onto the quintessentially British carpet beneath me. Something had tripped me up. "An eye for an eye. A truth for a truth," a boy's strangely ancient voice softly whispered. I felt a cold hand wrap itself around one of my ankles, and I screamed piercingly as I thrust my foot at the invisible attacker behind me. Ted was barking from a nearby room with a closed door. "Didn't get me. Blind as a bat, Mikey." The voice giggled again. "Who are you?" I sobbed, crawling across the carpet from a threat I could not see. "How do you know me?" I could see imprints in the carpet as the invisible boy crept towards me on hands and knees. "Eyes and lies, lies and eyes," he wheezed, seizing both of my ankles. I shrieked in terror as an unseen force with abnormal strength dragged me across the landing towards the room at the far end. As the door opened, I heard Ted barking manically. "Want its eyes?" the boy giggled. "Leave him alone!" I cried. I found myself lying on the floor of a room unlike the rest of the pristine house. It was derelict. There was a mattress in one corner, a sink with a mirror on the wall, and a small radiator that was rattling. Ted had been tied to it. "Just let us go," I pleaded. "Not until I thank you," the boy whispered, pacing across the rickety floorboards. "For what?" I asked. Above the dingy sink, a face suddenly appeared in the cloudy, unclean mirror. The boy was barely distinguishable, but I saw enough. Bulging too far out of their sockets were bloody eyes that seemed badly fixed in place. Eyes that I somehow recognised. Mine. But I didn't want to believe it. "Time to remember," the boy giggled. "My eyes now." I'd suppressed most of what happened to me 20 years earlier, but in that moment the boy's vicious voice rang some distant bell in my traumatised brain. A boy jumping me in the street, a vicious beating, a sharp instrument plunging into my sockets, and those words, "My eyes now." But that was 2003. It couldn't be the same boy. An ageless child with a blood-stained face, withered hands and bulbous eyes, grinning at me in the reflection of the mirror. He couldn't be human. "I feel bad, Mikey. Let me help you see." The malevolent thing smiled, walking away from the mirror and vanishing from my reflective field of view once again. I heard tussling at the radiator as the boy untied my dog, and Ted growled aggressively. "Get off him!" I cried, jumping to my feet and lunging blindly forwards. Fingernails slashed into my cheek from an unseen assailant, and I fell back to the floor. I couldn't see the boy or my dog, not without the aid of a mirror, but I must have distracted the horrid thing for long enough to give Ted the upper hand. A loud growl sounded, followed by an inhuman screech. Paws pounded against the floor, and I felt the warm, familiar stench of Ted's breath on my face. "Let's go!" I yelled. I jumped to my feet a second time and headed onto the landing, Ted brushing against my side. We scurried downstairs, not daring to look behind us. Not that it would have benefited me. With my dog leading the way, we stumbled through the kitchen's side door and returned to the safety of the darkness. Back to the real world. Far from that horror house. But it's still out there. and planning on moving away as soon as possible. I can still see that horrible red speck on the horizon from my bedroom window, the only visible thing in my darkened world, and I wish I hadn't seen what lives inside. My hearing aid picks up horrible sounds that nobody else notices. Ben? I bawled and blubbered. I could hear the doctor's voice. Following a motorcycle accident in early 2022, I lost my hearing and spent a tumultuous year in silence. I know many unfortunate people endure lifelong deafness, but my 18th year was the hardest of my life. For various reasons that aren't worth discussing, I had to wait a long time to receive a cochlear implant. The 2-week post-surgery wait for my device's activation was possibly the most arduous part of the entire ordeal. I just wanted the doctor to turn on the silly thing. Even as I sat in the hospital on the big day, I didn't believe it would actually work. I was ecstatic to be proven wrong. "Yes," I whispered to the doctor. "I can hear you." My parents embraced me, and we erupted into a chorus of contented sobbing. My older sister, Beth, looked up from her phone for a brief moment to acknowledge my existence. "Does this mean I can't insult this spotty loser to his face anymore?" she asked, grinning at me. "Oh, Beth," my mum huffed. "Sorry about that, Dr. Stewart." The old man chuckled. "No need to worry, Mrs. Hart. This is an exciting time for all of you. Now, Ben, it's important that we monitor your progress, okay? If you experience any issues with the implant, contact me." I nodded, smiling. I think I'd forgotten that I could actually speak again. Well, obviously, I never lost the ability to speak, but I had been self-conscious about the way my voice might sound. "Thanks, Dr. Stewart," I croaked with tears in my eyes. I'm so excited to listen to Radiohead again. "Lord, give me strength," Beth muttered. As my family and I were gleefully gliding down the long corridors of the hospital, lost in conversation, I disregarded numerous red flags. Overwhelmed by the hospital's cacophony of sound, I didn't pay attention to the noises that only I could hear. In hindsight, I realise I'd been overlooking unusual things from the second my implant had been activated. "Huh?" I asked my sister. "I didn't say anything, weirdo." "Mum, Ben's ears are broken again," Beth said. I snorted at her sassy quip, though my mum didn't seem to find it quite as funny. Still, I frowned, as I was certain I heard a voice say, "In the doorway." I shook it off. I mistook a voice on the radio for my sister, I thought. When we arrived home, there was a welcome party of friends from my sixth form, and relatives I hadn't seen in a long time. It was a jubilant occasion. My first ordinary evening in a year. The last ordinary evening of my life. It was on that first night, as I lay in bed, that some unholy breeze seeped beneath my duvet, biting my flesh with frozen fangs. Something was in the room with me. I could feel it, or rather, I could hear it. Everyday noises sounded, but they were entirely out of place. Fingernails tapping a wooden surface. Glass clinking glass. Rustling. One particular sound was quite unnerving. Squelching. footsteps in the muck of our rain-soaked garden. I ran to my bedroom window, looked outside, and saw nothing. But the foreboding footsteps persisted. The doctor had warned that things would sound tinny, but that wasn't what I was experiencing. My family and friends had all sounded robotic as they spoke. The voice in the car and the footsteps in the mud, however, had a distinctness to them, more intimate than any sound I'd ever heard before losing my hearing. At that moment, I recalled my walk through the hospital. Every noise, whether it had been my mother's voice or clacking computer keys, sounded slightly muffled and distorted. That was to be expected. And yet, a silky smooth voice had been buried somewhere in the mix. I just hadn't been able to distinguish the words over the racket.
And then I said there was all... Yeah, no, it's all...
In the doorway. I sat upright in my bed and listened to the paced, purposeful footsteps. I did consider that a noisy neighbour might be strolling through their own squelching garden. I considered that I might have gained superhuman hearing, but that didn't quell the fear in my heart. Eventually, the footsteps ceased, and I lay down, tucking myself beneath the duvet and closing my eyes. In the doorway. My toes curled until the nails had burrowed into my bedsheets. It was the whispery voice that I had heard in the car. It sounded as if it had been whispered directly into my ear. My eyelids flew open, and I sprang to a sitting position. There was nobody in the room, but I know what I heard. It wasn't an implant glitch. It wasn't the radio. It was a real voice. I started to hyperventilate, my skin itching under the weight of the invisible eyes that watched me. To an outside observer, all of this might be easily explainable, but I know what I heard, and I know what I felt. There was a real and present danger in that room. I didn't get any sleep. I sat in the dark for hours, eyeballing my bedroom wall. When I finally heard my sister saunter across the landing to get ready for work, I exhaled. I was still quivering, but at least I wasn't alone. She knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a reply.
"How'd you sleep, idiot?" she asked. "Any problems with the implant?"
Heart still racing, I feigned a smile and shook my head. No, I'm fine. I heard your deep masculine snores from the other end of the landing. It's working perfectly. Beth smiled and leant calmly against the doorframe.
Jokes aside, I missed our dumb chats. It's good to be able to talk to you again, Ben.
I grinned, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and I looked up to reply to my sister. To my horror, I found myself looking at a hand on Beth's shoulder. A decaying, near fleshless hand. Seemingly detached from any visible body, it tightly clenched my sister.
"You all right, little man?"
she asked, wincing and clutching her shoulder.
You look a little pale. Maybe you...
Before my sister could say another word, the frightful fingers tightly clawed into her body and tugged. Beth was torn backwards, fired by a phantom force into the banister. She tumbled over the edge. I screamed and ran out of my room,
only to find myself standing at the top of the stairs, faced with a sight I cannot scrub from my memory. My sister's body lay crumpled and disfigured at the foot of the staircase. My parents quickly emerged, screeching incoherently for help. As I stood there, transfixed by the horror of unfolding events, I felt something haunting. A hand on my own shoulder. Words tentatively trickled into my ear. "It's not polite to eavesdrop, Benjamin." I can read minds, but that doesn't mean I should. The ability has plagued me since birth. It's impossible to truly love anyone when you know their worst ideas and feelings. That's why few of us love ourselves. Horror lies in our unseen minds. Be honest. You know that to be so. Intrusive thoughts aren't indicative of our true selves. But I'm talking about the thoughts we do control. We all have dire dreams and sickening secrets. Things we only tell ourselves. And I'm talking about the minds of good people. This story isn't even about that. I could tell you plenty of terrible things that I've seen in good minds. No. This is the story of a train journey home. "I'd much rather be married to Jason," one passenger lamented. "I should accidentally send him a picture of..." "Oh, this is too easy. This girl believes anything I say," a man thought about his girlfriend. "I wonder what Grandma has left for me in her will," one teenager wondered. "I wish she'd hurry up and..." The thoughts of everyday people. Nothing extraordinarily dreadful. I've heard worse. Yet, I've never heard anything quite as sinister as the thoughts of the man a few rows in front of me. "Fresh soil and 11 roses for the garden," he thought. "One for each of them. One for each of their hearts. Or succulents, perhaps. Yes. Succulent, joyous hearts. My garden shall be." His internal monologue abruptly ceased. All sound on the train ceased, in fact, other than the gardener's sluggish breathing. Slow, paced inhales and exhales. The stranger adjusted himself in his seat, and the framework of the chair creaked, as if it were under unbearable strain. I felt blood pool in my mouth, and I realized my teeth had clamped down onto my tongue. Adrenaline had blinded me to the agony. And then came something more awful than the silence. "Hello," the gardener thought. "Robin is such a lovely name." My throat seized, and fear paralyzed me. The man knew my name, and that meant two things. He knew I was reading his mind, and he was reading mine too. "Don't be afraid," the man thought. "You have such a pure heart, Robin. A real delicacy." "Ticket, please." I swiveled to face the inspector in the aisle, and the sound of the carriage returned. I caught a glimpse of myself in the window. I was whiter than flour. "Are you okay, love?" the inspector asked. I cleared my throat. Yes, here." He inspected my ticket, nodded, and handed it back. "Yeah, these late night trains are brutal, aren't they? You look a little rough, love. Might be worth getting an early night tonight. I'd love to get an early night with you, the inspector thought. You're so hot. I feigned a smile, ignoring his thoughts, and watched the inspector walk away. That was when I realised the gardener had disappeared. My body was quaking, and my jumbled thoughts were finally starting to come together. What was his name? I wondered. Often, I can read more than a person's thoughts. I can read an entire mind. But I'd never come across a slate as blank as this nameless man. He was a void. Jerry was a rude ticket inspector, wasn't he? The gardener suddenly asked in my mind. So awful to know what lies in the hearts of humans, isn't it? Chilled to the core, I spun around, but I couldn't see the stranger. And his heart would taste like ash, the gardener continued. Have you ever tried one, Robin? Who are you? I fearfully thought. Ah, there you are, my rose, the gardener whispered in my head. Have you ever eaten a heart? It's the greatest way to read a person. Next stop, Ansdale and Fairhaven, the train tannoy announced. Driven by crippling fright, I sprang to my feet and marched to the entryway by the double doors. I'd always believed myself to be the only person with this ability, and stumbling across someone with the same power might have been a blessing, if it hadn't been the gardener. Everything about that man was wrong. Robin, the gardener whispered. Take a look. His mind was a dense book, but I knew exactly where to look. The train slowly approached the station, and I cautiously twisted my head to the door at the end of the aisle. I knew I'd see something ghastly, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Through the window of the aisle door, I could see only the gardener and Jerry. His flailing body was being pressed to the ceiling by the gardener's abnormally large hands. I felt his unwavering fear. Not the garden, the inspector pleaded. Please, not the garden. You're not fit for the garden, Jerry, the malicious stranger thought. I have another plot of land for you. Jerry screamed in his mind. No! What is that? What is that? No, please, the garden. I want to go. With a resounding squelching noise, Jerry finally stilled his seizing, and the gardener let his victim's corpse clunk to the floor of the empty train carriage. In the bloody palms of his hands, the murderous man victoriously cradled the inspector's heart. Nobody else in my carriage had seen or heard a thing. Only I saw the inhuman man. Only I saw his lifeless eyes and terrible smile. There was nothing in his mind, nothing to read but blackness. And then, I see you, the gardener thought. The dark joy in the farthest corner of your mind. You're glad I put that pig out of his misery. You're happy. You're content. And that will only make your heart taste sweeter, Robin. The 12th rose in my garden. The train finally rolled to a stop at Ansdale and Fairhaven. I furiously jammed the open button with my index finger, squeezing through the half-open doors onto the platform. There, I waited in fear for the gardener to join me. But he didn't. The stranger observed me from the window of his empty carriage as the train pulled away. I locked my gaze onto his glazed eyes, preferring those lifeless spheres to the lips drenched in Jerry's blood. Not yet, the gardener thought, smiling horribly. I'll wait for your heart to ripen, Robin. That was 2 months ago, and I read about the grisly discovery of the train inspector's body on a local news site. It wasn't some fever dream on the late-night train. It really happened. I've barely slept since. I lie awake at night, feeling eyes upon me. Not upon my body, but my mind. I feel the gardener rooting around in there, as if I were a rose in his flower patch. Sometimes, in a fit of fright, I see the curve of that carnivorous smile in the darkened corner of my bedroom, waiting to devour my heart. But fear is a good thing. I'll stay unhappy forever. After all, when I lower my guard and finally allow myself to enjoy life again, that's when he'll come for me. The gardener likes succulent, joyous hearts.